A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
You ever look at a 3,000-page bill or a 70-page Supreme Court opinion and think, man, that person is a prolific writer? I mean, how does a senator find the time to craft 500 pages of tax code between fundraisers, committee hearings, and television appearances? It is a level of productivity that would make a Victorian novelist blush.
It is the great illusion of modern governance, corn. The name on the spine is rarely the hand on the keys. We have this romantic, almost cinematic image of the solitary lawmaker burning the midnight oil, or the wise justice scratching out a landmark ruling with a fountain pen in the quiet mahogany-paneled study. We want to believe in the great author of our laws because it gives us a single point of accountability.
Right, the great author myth. It is much more comforting to think that the person we voted for is the one actually choosing the words that might send someone to jail, or change how much they pay in property taxes. But today's prompt from Daniel asks us to look behind the curtain. He wants us to dig into the invisible architects, the ghostwriters of our legal system. We are talking about the clerks, the career civil servants, the legislative council, and the interest groups who actually author the texts that govern our lives.
It is a fascinating look at the plumbing of democracy. We focus so much on the high politics, the speeches, the floor votes, the televised arguments, but we rarely talk about the people who choose the specific adjectives and the semicolons. And, as any lawyer will tell you, the semicolon is often where the actual power resides. These invisible architects determine how laws function in the real world long after the campaign posters have been taken down.
And that is where the power hides, isn't it? In the nuance. If I can write the definition section of a bill, I've already won half the battle before you even get to the floor for a vote. If I can define innovation or small business in a specific way, I have already steered the ship.
That is the technical mechanism of influence. When you look at the sheer volume of output from modern legislatures and courts, it is physically impossible for the principals, the senators, the MPs, the justices, to be the primary authors. We have moved from a system of personal authorship to a system of bureaucratic oversight. The invisible architects are the ones actually building the structure. The politicians are just the ones cutting the ribbon at the opening ceremony and taking the credit.
Let's start with the legislative side, because the contrast between different systems is pretty wild. You've been looking into the United Kingdom model versus what we see here in the United States. It sounds like the British have a much more centralized, almost monastic approach to this ghostwriting.
The United Kingdom model is incredibly distinct and, in many ways, the gold standard for technical precision. They have what is called the Office of the Parliamentary Counsel, or the OPC. It is a centralized elite corps of approximately 54 highly specialized lawyers. Their entire job, their only job, is to take the policy instructions from the government and translate them into statute speak.
54 people writing everything for an entire nation? That seems like a tiny bottleneck for a country of 67 million people.
It is a deliberate bottleneck, corn. The idea is that by having a small centralized group, you ensure linguistic precision and consistency across the entire body of law. If you have the same 54 people, or at least people trained in the same rigorous tradition, writing every bill, you don't get the kind of linguistic drift that creates legal loopholes. These are career civil servants, not political appointees. They stay through different administrations. Jessica de Mountenay is currently the first Parliamentary Counsel, and she oversees this body of work that is known for being technically superior but famously dry. They don't care about the vision or the rhetoric. They care about whether the law is effective and certain.
So, in London, the invisible architect is a professional, neutral technician, a ghost in the machine who doesn't have a political dog in the fight. But in Washington, the picture is a bit more Fractured?
Fractured is a polite way to put it. In the United States, we do have the office of the Legislative Counsel in both the House and the Senate. They were established back in 1919 and 1918, and they do incredible work under immense pressure. But they are often competing with outside forces in a way the British OPC simply isn't. Because our system is so decentralized and our legislative staffs are so stretched thin, we have a massive vacuum, and nature and Washington abhors a vacuum.
And that vacuum gets filled by the shadow architects. We actually touched on this back in episode 1148 when we talked about think tanks. It is that same phenomenon where a staffer for a senator gets a draft from a friendly interest group, changes the header, and suddenly it is the Protecting American Innovation Act.
That is legislative capture via the keyboard. If you are a 24-year-old legislative assistant with 3 hours to turn around a draft on a complex telecommunications issue, and a lobbyist from a major tech firm or a think tank like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, hands you a polished, legally sound document that accomplishes your boss's goal, the temptation to copy and paste is overwhelming. ALEC is famous for this at the state level. They produce model legislation on everything from private prisons to environmental regulations. A busy state legislator in a part-time legislature receives this model bill, and it becomes law almost verbatim.
It is efficient, but it creates a massive transparency gap. The public thinks their elected representatives sat down and thought through the implications of a bill, but the DNA of that bill was actually engineered in a boardroom 3 blocks away or in a think tank's office. We are essentially outsourcing the thinking part of lawmaking to the people who are being regulated.
And that brings us back to the democracy dashboard we discussed in episode 867. Is democracy a living practice of the people, or is it a technical output of an elite bureaucracy and its associated interest groups? In the United Kingdom, the OPC provides a shield of neutrality. They act as a filter. If a minister wants a law that is legally impossible or nonsensical, the OPC tells them no, or finds a way to make it work within the existing framework. In the United States, the drafting process is often the front line of the political battle itself. The invisible architect isn't a neutral ghost. They are often a partisan combatant.
It feels like the United States system has effectively privatized the role of the invisible architect. If you have the resources to maintain a team of elite lawyers to draft model bills and white papers that look like legislation, you have a massive advantage over the average citizen whose input is just a phone call to a staffer who is probably overwhelmed and looking for an easy win.
And this isn't just about lobbyists. It is about the loss of institutional memory within the government itself. When we cut the budgets for nonpartisan legislative researchers and drafters, we are essentially forcing our representatives to rely on the generosity of outside groups to do the heavy lifting of writing.
Moving from the halls of Parliament and the corridors of Congress to the chambers of the Supreme Court, this is where the invisible architect role gets even more opaque. If people think legislators are the authors of their bills, they almost certainly believe Supreme Court justices are the authors of their opinions. That is the whole point of the life tenure and the robes, right? To signify a singular, monumental intellectual authority.
Right, the image of the 9 sitting in their mahogany-paneled chambers, wrestling with the Constitution like ancient philosophers. But the reality is that the clerkship system has turned the Supreme Court into what some critics call a high-end editing house.
Give us the numbers here, Herman, because this is the part that usually shocks people who aren't in the legal world.
The numbers are staggering. Current research and historical analysis suggest that roughly 30% of Supreme Court opinions are almost entirely clerk-authored. And by clerk-authored, I mean the first draft, the structure, the research, and the bulk of the prose come from a 26-year-old who graduated from law school maybe 2 years ago. The justice might provide a memo of instructions or an outline, but the actual writing, the choice of words that will be cited for the next century, is done by the clerk.
30% seems high, but I bet for some justices it is even higher. I remember reading that Justice Scalia was one of the few who really pushed back against that trend. He was known for being a bit of a prose stylist, wasn't he?
Scalia was famous for his heavy hand. He would take a clerk's draft and rewrite it so thoroughly that the original was often unrecognizable. He wanted his voice, his specific brand of originalism, to be the one on the page. He famously said that he didn't want to be a glorified editor. Justices like Brandeis or Douglas in the past were also known for being deeply involved in the manual labor of writing. Douglas was so fast he would often finish his drafts before the other justices had even finished their research. But today, the sheer volume of cases and the complexity of the cert pool makes that kind of personal authorship very difficult.
Explain the cert pool for a second, because that feels like the ultimate gatekeeper mechanism. If you want to talk about invisible architects, the people who decide what the court even looks at are the most invisible of all.
The cert pool is a fascinating piece of judicial bureaucracy. Most of the justices, currently everyone except for Alito and Gorsuch, pool their clerks together to review the roughly 7,000 to 8,000 petitions that come to the court every year. These clerks read the petitions and write pool memos, recommending whether the court should hear a case or not.
So these 20-somethings are literally the filters for what the highest court in the land even considers. If a clerk is having a bad day or doesn't like the look of a specific petition, it might never even reach a justice's desk.
They are the ultimate gatekeepers. If a clerk writes a dismissive memo, that case is likely dead. It creates this closed ecosystem of legal thought. And look at the pedigree of these architects. For the current October term 2025, alumni from the University of Chicago Law School are represented in 7 different Supreme Court chambers. We are talking about a very small, very elite group of people who all went to the same 3 or 4 schools, clerked for the same 3 or 4 feeder circuit judges, and now they are the ones framing the arguments for the highest court.
It creates an ideological self-reinforcement loop. If the clerks all come from the same intellectual tradition, the same shadow curriculum, as we might call it, the drafts they produce will naturally reflect that tradition. Even if a justice is overseeing, the work, the menu of options, and the framing of the legal questions are all set by the clerks. It is hard to choose option C if your clerk only presents you with option A and option B.
It is a soft power that is almost impossible to regulate. You have these young, brilliant, but often ideologically rigid individuals who are effectively ghostwriting the precedents that will govern the country for decades. There is a reason why a Supreme Court clerkship is the most valuable credential in the legal world. You aren't just learning from a justice, you are often doing the work of a justice. And that work follows you into the private sector, where these former clerks are paid $500,000 signing bonuses by law firms specifically because they know how the invisible architects think.
I wonder if that contributes to why judicial opinions have gotten so much longer and more academic over the years. If you look at an opinion from 1920, it is often 5 pages of direct, forceful prose. Today they are 80-page monsters with 300 footnotes. If you are a young clerk fresh out of a law review, you want to show off. You want the footnotes, the obscure citations, the 3-part tests.
You hit the nail on the head. There is a noticeable shift in the voice of the court. It has become more bureaucratic, more law review-ish, and less like the direct, forceful prose of the early 20th century. When the invisible architect is trying to impress their peers or their future law firm partners, the writing changes. It becomes more about defensive writing, plugging every possible hole with a footnote rather than clear, accessible legal reasoning.
It makes me think about the global spectrum of democracy we talked about in episode 1183. If the actual text of our laws and judgments is being produced by a hidden elite, does that change where we sit on that spectrum? Are we moving toward a technocracy of the ghostwriters, where the elected part is just a thin veneer over a professional class of drafters?
It certainly challenges the idea of democratic agency. If I vote for a representative because I like their vision, but their vision is translated into law by a lobbyist lawyer or a career bureaucrat I can't name, how much power do I actually have? The invisible architect is the one who decides where the doors and windows go. I just get to pick the color of the curtains.
And now we have to talk about the next evolution of this, which Daniel mentioned in his prompt, artificial intelligence. If we are already comfortable with invisible architects who are human, how long until the invisible architect is a large language model?
It is already happening, Korn. We are seeing the emergence of AI tools specifically designed for legislative drafting and judicial research. In some jurisdictions, judges are already using AI to help draft routine orders. Think about the efficiency argument. An AI can check for conflicts with existing statutes across 50 states in seconds. It can ensure consistent terminology across a 10,000-page code. It is the ultimate parliamentary counsel.
But it also accelerates the copy-paste problem. If a lobbyist can use an AI to generate 500 different versions of a model bill, tailored to the specific legal quirks of every state legislature in the country, the invisible architect becomes an invisible factory. We could see a flood of perfectly drafted but completely unaccountable legislation hitting state houses simultaneously.
That is the accountability vacuum. If an AI drafts a bill and it contains a hallucination, a reference to a non-existent case, or a subtle legal loophole that no human caught because the bill was too long to read, who is responsible? The legislator who signed it? The developer who trained the model? The interest group that prompted it? We are moving toward a world where the author is a prompt, not a person.
It feels like we are losing the soul of authorship in the law. There is something important about a human being, a justice or a senator, having to put their name on a thought and defend it. When you outsource that to a clerk or an AI, you lose that personal moral weight. You lose the sense that the law is a human conversation across time.
I agree, but the counter-argument is always complexity. Our world is too complex for a single human mind to hold all the variables of a modern environmental regulation or a global trade agreement. We need the invisible architects because the alternative is a system that simply stops functioning. We have traded individual genius for institutional process.
So, what is the takeaway for the person listening to this? If the architects are invisible, how do we hold the building to account? How do we look past the great author myth?
One practical takeaway is the need for drafting transparency. There have been serious proposals to require the disclosure of who contributed to the text of a bill. Imagine if every bill came with a metadata tag, like a nutrition label for law. It could show that 30% was written by the Legislative Council, 40% was provided by a specific think tank, and 10% was a direct copy from a previous statute.
Like a track changes for democracy. I love that. It would be like the open source model for software, but for law. You can see the commits and who made them. If a specific sentence was added at 2 in the morning by a lobbyist's IP address, the public should know that.
That is the direction we should be moving in. If we can't stop the ghostwriting, we should at least make the ghost visible. There are open source legislative tracking tools out there now, like Open States or the advanced features on congress.gov that allow you to compare drafts and see exactly when a specific sentence was added or removed.
That is the democracy dashboard in action. If you are a listener who cares about a specific issue, whether it is environmental law or tech regulation, don't just look at the final bill. Go to these sites and look at the versions. See if you can spot the moment the invisible architect stepped in. Look for the model legislation language.
And on the judicial side, pay attention to the clerkship announcements. When you see that a specific law school or a specific feeder judge is dominating the chambers of the Supreme Court, that tells you something about the future of legal thought. It is the shadow curriculum of the judiciary. If all the architects are trained in the same style, they are going to build the same kind of house.
It is wild to think that some of the most powerful people in the country might be a handful of 26-year-olds in Chicago or New Haven who are really good at writing memos. They are the ones who decide which arguments are serious and which are fringe.
It is the ultimate weird prompt. We tell these young people, tell us what the law should be, and they answer. And because they are brilliant and hard-working, we accept their answers as the voice of the court or the voice of the legislature.
Before we wrap this up, I want to circle back to that AI point. If we reach a point where the invisible architect is entirely non-human, does the concept of precedent even matter anymore? If an AI is just optimizing for a specific outcome based on a prompt from a judge, is that law or is that just output?
That is the existential threat to the legal profession. Law is supposed to be a human conversation across time. It is about stare decisis, standing by things decided. If we turn it into an optimization problem for a machine, we are essentially saying that the great author was never important to begin with. We are saying the law is just a set of instructions, like code for a computer.
It's like we are building a cathedral, but we have forgotten who the architect was, and now we are just letting a robot add more bricks because it is faster.
I think we have to fight to keep the invisible architects as visible as possible. Whether it is a human clerk or an algorithm, the provenance of the law matters. Who wrote it, why they wrote it, and who paid for the ink? Those are the questions that keep a democracy healthy.
This has been a fascinating deep dive. It definitely makes me want to go back and reread some of those Shadow Architects episodes. It is all connected. The think tanks, the clerks, the lobbyists. They are all part of this hidden layer of our government.
There is so much more to dig into here, especially as the October term 2025 progresses, and we see how these clerk networks influence the big rulings coming down the pipeline this summer. We will have to keep an eye on the prose styles to see if we can spot the clerkly influence.
Well, I think we have given people plenty to chew on. The next time you see a headline about a landmark ruling or a historic bill, just remember there is probably a very tired 20-something or a very specialized counsel in the background who actually did the heavy lifting.
And they are probably the ones who decided where that crucial semicolon went.
Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flemingtop for keeping the invisible architecture of this show running smoothly. He is our own first Parliamentary Counsel.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the research and generation of My Weird Prompts.
If you are enjoying these deep dives into the hidden plumbing of our world, a quick review on your favorite podcast app really helps us out. It's the best way to help new listeners find the show and join the conversation.
You can also find us at myweirdprompts.com for our full archive, including those episodes on think tanks and the spectrum of democracy.
This has been My Weird Prompts. We will be back next time with another deep dive into whatever is on Daniel's mind.
Until then, keep an eye on those invisible architects.
See ya.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow take